Moving on then to the 10th tablet. He came in out of the desert, a shambling, walking wreck of a man, a human ghost with sunken, wasted eyes and hollow cheeks, burnt skin and matted locks, carrying a spear and wearing a longbow and a lion skin kilt. He was enormous and terrifying, and the men in the tavern, a dark, dusty room where they were sitting around in groups upon rugs on the floor drinking beer, with murky arms of orange sunlight crawling over them as they looked at him with yellow, wary eyes over the tops of their cups. A woman was serving tumblers of beer and wine from a stall, and Gilgamesh stalked through the crowded, smoky, opalescent air and went straight toward her and said to her, "I am Gilgamesh, and I am seeking a way across the lower sea to find Utnapishti. Do you know how I can find him?" And she said to him, "Gilgamesh, no one has ever sought Utnapishti. The way to Dilmun is long and dangerous. Only the sun god travels along that path. It is not a path for mere wind-blown mortals of frail flesh such as yourself, but only a path for the gods of the heavens. I must find a way. If a way can be found, I must find it. And if it cannot be done, then I will wander the wild. My friend Enkidu has died, and I have no wish to become like him. I must find Utnapishti, for he is a human who has become immortal, and he will know the secret if there is one. He survived the flood 26,000 years ago, and he is still alive. He will know he can teach me what I need to know. It is possible that you could fetch a ride with Urshanabi, the man who carries coffins, to Dilmun. He is outside felling trees for his boat. He can take you across the waters of the lower sea, if he is willing to try him. Try him, Gilgamesh." Urshanabi was outside, felling palm trees with a bronze axe. He had 2 stone men helping him, with their bodies made of schist and granite and limestone that scraped and grated rock against rock as they moved, picking up piles of palm wood and carrying them to Urshanabi's huge reed boat, a magur, docked at the quay. "You are the men who takes coffins to Dilmun?" And Urshanabi said that he was. And Gilgamesh said, "Will you take me to Utnapishti, my friend? My friend has died, and I wander the wild. And I wish to become immortal like him." And no, said Urshanabi, "no mortal men are allowed to go to Dilmun. It is a place that has been set aside by the gods, specifically for Utnapishti, whom they rewarded with eternal life for surviving the archaic ancient flood that lay waste to the earth millennia ago." Rage and fury overcoming him, Gilgamesh smashed the stone men to pieces, shattering their rock bodies with his axe and throwing the pieces of them into the river. And Urshanabi looked at him aghast. "Sir," he said, "you have just destroyed the only means I have for getting to Dilmun. What's wrong with you, my friend?" And Gilgamesh said, "Now you will take me to see Utnapishti, and I will be your crew, and together we will sail across the lower sea and through the waters of death to get to Dilmun." "Then carry the logs," Urshanabi told him. "It is a long ride." They began the journey to Dilmun in Urshanabi's boat, a magur, made out of tied reed bundles with a cabin of mulberry wood and woven reed matting and 1 large sail, and inside the boat there were 5 pinewood coffins with dead men in them, which Urshanabi was transporting to Dilmun for burial, but they did not smell because they had been specially treated with oils and incense to prevent this. They passed the salt pans at the headwaters of the gulf, the river a silvery white strip slicing a green and yellow landscape woven out of date palms, acacias, pomegranate trees, and poplars, small pink villages of flat-roofed houses with logs sticking out of them, men riding in reed crafts with dingy polychrome sails sewn together out of patchworks of fabrics, floating past them on the shores, brick kilns that appeared at intervals, their cracked and misshapen hills spewing forth gritty smoke into the sky like miniature volcanoes, piles of cooked bricks that lay about them in fresh newborn heaps. At first they had some trouble gaining control of the ship. No sooner had it been launched with sail hoisted and centerboard dropped than it went careening straight for the starboard side riverbanks. Palm fronds slapped the tops of their heads as they went by, both of them pushing along the banks with punting poles, and then Gilgamesh wrestled with the sail and Urshanabi gripped the tillers of the 2 rudder oars. But after the brief struggle with the craft, they were sailing pleasantly along, crossing over the naked shadows of late afternoon palms that reached out across the water like crooked old men's fingers. In a couple of days they had reached the mouthwaters of the Gulf. Thick with stratified mud, the land on the port side was a barren, treeless plain encrusted with salt, which gleamed upon the ground in large white polyhedrons. On the starboard side, huge funnels of black smoke stained the fabric of the sky where villagers were burning off desiccated patches of summer-scorched vegetation to make way for the coming plowing season. Vultures and kites and gray crows hovering to swoop down upon the animals, chased out by the burning fires. Shrew mice and jerboas, snakes and lizards beyond the spectacle. The land began to sink all around them into spongy bogs and clumps of reeds, empty tidal flats. The water was becoming viscous with silt, and as the tide changed and sucked it back up into the river, he worried that the ship might become grounded in the mud banks all around them. But a strong northerly wind picked up and pushed against the sail, and the ship ran ahead of it through the mud and the silt until they began to ride the first swells from the saltwater ocean ahead of them, vast and empty and serene as a cloudless sky. An enormous blue vista opened before them, and the hinge where the sea met the sky was a nacreous band of haze that shaded off into the stark and glaring cerulean above. As the northerly wind picked up, it chopped the sea into waves with crests of white foam, which caused the boat to roll heavily occasionally. Occasionally they glimpsed the dark gray humps of porpoises or the distant speck of a seagull, but no other life beyond that, only a rolling plain of undulating turquoise hills that stretched to the horizon. The days were long, and there was very little to do to keep them occupied. The sail had to be kept trimmed, the tillers manned, the rigging taut, but otherwise seagulls landed at either end of the boat, where they were perched atop the reed bundles like mastheads, and sat staring, beaks slightly open as though about to comment. Most days Gilgamesh just sat upon the foredeck, drowsing in sunlight, while the ship rolled to and fro. A gale picked up and the waves were high. The sea was furrowed with deep, narrow troughs that came at them athwart, and they clung tightly to the rigging. The ship rose and fell, and the wind kicked foamy blasts over the gunwales. The sky was a polished robin's egg blue, smooth and cloudless, and they decided to anchor off the coast of Agarum Island to await favorable winds. The island became visible as a thin yellow wafer of sandstone, and as they approached, they could see distant columns of smoke rising from its villages. A few small huts nestled amongst the cliffs like birds' nests, and they dropped 2 heavy limestone anchors into the cove, and they waited as the wind blew all day and didn't stop until sunset, and then they brought up the anchors and hoisted the sail and coasted on the favorable winds. When a ragged sun floated up at dawn, the wind had died completely, and the ship lay becalmed in a flat and lavender sea. Nothing moved. The sail, which had been flapping all night, lay against the mast without a sound. The waters, a flat, glassy surface upon which both the ship and the sun doubled themselves for 2 more days. The ship was becalmed, and they went nowhere, and they were running out of water, so Urshanabi decided to make an offering to Ishkur, the storm god, and poured half their remaining water supply into a steatite bowl, and then threw it over the bow into the sea. And Gilgamesh thought he was crazy. But the following day the wind picked up, although it was blowing in the wrong direction, and they had to tack to prevent it from carrying them back upriver. Urshanabi took his bearing against the stars at night. He was holding a wooden square from which a string dangled with knots tied at intervals, and he put the lowest knot in his mouth and held the square away until the string was taut. Then he held out 3 fingers parallel to each other and closed one eye, measuring the distance of the pole star from the horizon each night. Each night the distance was a little different, but it told him how far they'd come. One morning Gilgamesh was standing on the gunwale, and he was lifting a bucket of seawater, just about to pour it over his head for a bath, when a bright red snake uncoiled from the bucket, tapped him on the shoulder, and fell onto the deck at his feet. Quickly he reached down and grabbed it by its tail, and then flung it back out into the water and looked out at the sea. It was full of snakes. Yellow, red, black, and brown ones, they went floating by in wiggling hordes. Poisonous snakes, Urshanabi said. Now you know why these are called the waters of death. And he smiled jovially. A wall of clouds shaped like purple cliffs on the vast horizon, with mauve canyons and gray valleys that were smeared with sooty black patches of rain which fell in long lavender streams that trailed over the edge of the sky like ropes. Lightning snapped and popped within them, flashing incandescent blue sheets that glowed for a moment, then vanished with a rumbling. This was going on in the distance to the west, but the wind was blowing furiously and the waves were riding high again as the ship rose and fell over the troughs with a sickening motion. The winds were southerly, and they were blowing the storm in a parallel direction to their route. The sky above remained a dark, deep violet color with little swatches of gray-blue clouds like islands. And then the next day, there it was. Dilmun was visible on the horizon as a pair of islands, the northern island a long, thin, white strip of land. To the east it was small and uninhabited, for it was the southern island that was Dilmun, with its lone central mountain, a dim, whitish-yellow hump, and it was here that they navigated the ship to the harbor, which was separated from an ancient decaying mud-brick fortress by a wall of limestone blocks. They pulled the ship into the deserted quay and laid out a plank, and Gilgamesh stepped down onto Dilmun, over which there reigned only a ghostly silence, for there were no people about, although the traces of their former presence once long ago could be found everywhere. Urshanabi had to bring them a pair of white donkeys whose bellies had been painted bright red with palm prints in henna, and Gilgamesh followed him past groves of date palms swarming with flies and mosquitoes and birds in a dense heavy wall of brown and green foliage intercut with irrigation ditches, palmwood boards. Palmwood boards had been laid across many of these ditches as makeshift bridges over which Gilgamesh and Urshanabi guided their donkeys. They went along the borders of fruit gardens made up of pomegranate trees, passing some dusty gray date palms, and on a hill lined with small square stones and mortar, goats wandering and cattle munching grass in the field. After a time they came to a bare yellow hill with a clump of 3 or 4 palm trees giving shade to a little barasti house. The house was made from delicately woven palm fronds, and it was in the shape of a cube with a flat roof. Urshanabi climbed down off his donkey and went over to the open rectangular doorway and called out that he had arrived, and an old man emerged, wearing a mustard-colored kilt and no shirt. His skin was golden brown, and he had a large nose and a short, neatly trimmed white beard. The man looked at Gilgamesh and motioned for him to come inside, while Urshanabi climbed onto his donkey and headed back to the quay to busy himself with the coffins. The palm house was dark inside, and Gilgamesh stood for a while adjusting his eyes to the gloom. The old man had a fire going in one corner. The floor crunched beneath his feet. It was made up of reed mats laid upon crushed seashells. "Have a seat," the man said in a strange and archaic dialect of Sumerian that he had not heard before. "I will make us some tea," he said, and Gilgamesh seated himself cross-legged upon a reed mat near the hearth, while the old man poured out hot tea with shaking hands into 2 clay cups. "Now, sir," he said, bringing the tea, "what can I do for you?" "I am looking for Uttanapishti. Do you know where I can find him?" "Yes, I am Uttanapishti. How can I help you?" 11th Tablet. Behold the earth, Gilgamesh. A flat brown disk of broken rock, rubble, junk heap, and black space with spacious curves and mountainous contours, and it is surrounded by a laminate blue ring of ocean water. But holes begin to appear at the edges of the brown, where the rocks meet the sea, and slowly the blue water begins to submerge the brown disk, filling it with runnels, as the mountains disappear, and the disk becomes entirely a deep aqua blue-green copper verdigris color. This is what happened to the earth in the days of the great flood, Gilgamesh, that submerged the planet. I was a priest of the god Enki-Ea in the temple in the city of Shurupak, and the god made known to me his voice, inside of a dream wherein he spoke to me from the other side of a reed wall. "Uttanapishti," he said, and I listened to the voice coming through the grate. "The gods have all gathered together in council, and they have decided that mankind is too noisy, and there are too many of you, and Enlil, the god of the earth, has decided to send a great flood that will drown all of creation. Anu went up to the heavens, and I, Enki, went down to the Apsu, but the flat green-brown swale of the earth is the jurisdiction of Enlil, and he has decreed that the earth shall be no more, that human beings shall be no more, and that only gods shall prevail." This was a terrifying thing for me to hear, Gilgamesh. Think of it. I didn't know what to do, but the god Enki-Ea told me to build a gigantic boat in the shape of a cube, and to inform the city that my god was not happy in a city with the god Enlil, his enemy, and that I should build a ship to go away to the Apsu at Eridu and join my god in deep contemplation there, and that is exactly what I told them I would do. And the craftsmen came to help me build the boat, a giant wood and mud effigy rubble heap built from the scraps of every piece of wood we could find. Palm wood, mulberry, acacia, cedar wood, we put them all together, and the ship grew an enormous wood-framed skeleton with something prehistoric that sat on sledges of the coppery submerged blue-green river water, a shape that was large enough as it was filled in, and grew itself a skin of wood to blot out the sun and the clouds. Came huge, enormous cliffs and canyons of giant black clouds sodden with black rain that began at first to pour forth lightly, and then the people grew worried when the rains came heavily, and I climbed inside the boat, Gilgamesh, climbed up the ladder and got inside and watched and waited, and the sea levels rose, giant teal, turquoise, dark gray, angry waves that rose and submerged the earth, and the boat broke free from its moorings, Gilgamesh, and began to float. It drifted over the dark gray waters as the purple horizon with red-orange clouds ruptured and spilled forth, and the sea rose copper and lovely with red blood and azure where the horizon met the hinge of the earth, and the trees rolling like palm logs in the waters, and the dead floating swollen bulbous bodies with hinged jaws and rotting melted teeth and white fish-belly eyes as they swam past, and floods of carp and tuna and other fish loaded up swollen green and gray, and entire walls of broken mud hut junk houses broke off as the currents of water rolled forth, and dug black runnels into the ground and sought passage through the city, overtopping the walls, the palm trees beginning to float, and pouring in the water levels, rising and filling every street, every blank niche, coming full with dark, coppery gray, wet rainwater, and the sodden humans fleeing everywhere, tiny, pale, pink creatures, as though they had a chance, running with the children and fleeing as the floods carried donkeys with broken heads, and merchants and mothers and children and babies all floated, all crashed together in one massive grinding heap of flesh, bone, and mud brick. The water ate the walls of the temple away, submerged them, and ground the earth to a pulp. The black gray heavens broke open as though someone had pulled a plug, and the earth filled up and ran over with mud-wet streets and serried stacks of city houses just peeking up above the mud silt-infested viscous waters with red-pink colors of the dying as they floated by. And the earth ruptured into the water, and the water ate the earth, and the sky melted into it, and all of it was drained into a wasted pile of wrack and broken human effort that was no more for the gods. For the gods had decreed that we should all die. And the ship sailed, a black behemoth covered with pitch and tar, but it sailed, and the black cube of the cabin I stood forth inside and watched the rains come, and they came, Gilgamesh, transforming the earth into one gigantic blue-green dark prehistoric primordial ocean. And then they stopped. The cloud's mighty mud-brick behemoths began to roll away, and portions of the blue sky ate its way in through the blackness, Gilgamesh. And huge archaic slabs of ancient green sunlight cut through the clouds and dropped down into the abyss that the god Enlil had rendered, the earth an arcuate, wasted wreck now of sodden trees and dead purple fish-belly white humans. And the waters began to drain in the gold slices of sunlight that reflected on the polished mirror's surface. We stayed in the boat and waited, and I sent forth a dove to find dry land, but there was none yet. And it returned, and I sent forth a swallow, but there was still none. And I sent forth a raven, and it did not return. So I knew that land had appeared, and the sun with a furious onrush of energy began to drain the water as though someone had pulled a bath plug, and the waters evaporated, leaving huge chunks of serrated geological masses thrusting up through the blue mirror of the ocean. And then the boat came to rest on one of these ancient masses, a dim, dark mountain, and the waters receded, and we found our way out onto the foredeck, where we watched the new creation as the waters drained away bit by bit, and the boat was stuck in the mountains, and the gods came down, Gilgamesh. Enlil, Enki, Ninersag, Anu, and Belit Eli, they all came down forth, and Enlil was furious that a single lone human being had survived, and he tried to dump his wrath upon me. But Enki blocked him and told him that if he had not saved me, who would there be to tend the rites and feed the gods and do their work for them? And Enlil seemed to relent. He walked away, and Belit Eli, the goddess mother, was crying, and she raised her necklace of lapis lazuli flies and held it forth as a sign, a token of the great disaster that had befallen them all because of Enlil's temper. And he looked at me again, and as though the ghost of his wrath had shaded off, there came a hint of compassion, and he spoke, and he told me that I alone should be made immortal, and that my wife and I should be placed upon this island, Gilgamesh. This island here, Dilmun, set aside specifically for my wife and I to live, and that's where we've been ever since. You are immortal, Gilgamesh. There is absolutely nothing I can do for you, not a single thing. I do not possess any secrets that will make you immortal. You are human and doomed, and you will die like they all die, my friend, wasted, sick, limp, and spent. But I will tell of one thing, Gilgamesh. As you leave, I will tell you of the plant that lies beneath the sea, which if you eat it will give you back your youth. And you will take Urshanabi back to Uruk with you, because he has violated a sacred taboo in bringing you here. So he may no longer bring the dead here to this island. But I will show you one last thing, one last secret before you go. Follow me. The landscape was barren and nearly treeless, stretching before them as a flat white plain, every so often a low round construction of stones that looked like a well would appear, marking a conduit to the underground water channels, which had been carved into the land. They followed the course of one of these channels, which led them to a low brown wall near what appeared on the horizon to be some bushes, actually revealed themselves to be the tops of palm trees. The wall dropped sheer down its opposite side to a small grassy canyon where a freshwater spring bubbled up into a crystal-clear pool of water. They went down a flight of steps which had been carved into the wall and followed it to the pool, which was so pellucid that Gilgamesh could see the stones on the bottom. He knelt at the edge of the spring and cupped his hands to drink the spring water. "The spring is sacred to the god Inzak," the old man told him, "as are all the springs upon the island. There are many of them all over Dilmun. It is the only place in the lower sea where such fresh water can be found bubbling up directly from the Apsu. That is why it is such a holy place, and it is why people send their bodies here to be buried, and Urshanabi brings them, because only the dead are allowed here on this island, Gilgamesh. No living man or woman. Come, I will show you the tombs." Gilgamesh carried the old man on his back, and they went out beyond the shady groves to a wide open plain, where for as far as the eye could see it was covered with thousands of low, brown gravel hills, so closely packed together that there was barely room enough to walk between them. The mounds continued across the naked land on toward the painted blue ceiling of the enamel sky. Each was a tomb containing the body of a single human being. They varied in size. Some were over 40 feet high, others only 10 or so. The plain looked like an ocean made out of miniature volcanoes. "They are seeds," Uttanapishti said in his ear. "Each person who is buried in the soil of Dilmun is a seed that will bear the tree of a new life in the netherworld. It is as though we are looking at the roots of upside-down trees, which are not visible because they grow straight down into the earth. Dilmun is particularly well situated in relation to the netherworld, for the souls drop like fruits from these trees directly into it, as though the realm of Kur were a gigantic fruit basket." And the next day, Gilgamesh and Urshanabi went to go find the plant that Uttanapishti had told them of, the plant that would restore Gilgamesh to his youth. And he stood on the foredeck in the pink sunlight and stripped off all his clothing. He placed a clip made out of tortoise shell upon his nostrils to keep them closed, and hung a small net basket around his neck. Then he tied a rope weighted by a stone to one of his ankles and tumbled over the side of the boat into the copper-green water. After about a minute had gone by, he tugged on the rope, and Urshanabi hauled him up. He crawled over the edge of the boat, black hair pasted to his scalp, and tossed the basket onto the deck. It contained a strange-looking green sea plant with fibrils and small pink appendages. They opened the basket to release the plant, but while Gilgamesh was busy on the foredeck, a snake came up and ate the plant, and that is why the snake sheds its skin perpetually young again. And Gilgamesh returned to the city of Uruk an abject failure, his quest in ruins, and his mind unilluminated with any vision save that of a ruinous mortality from whence he could never salvage himself. Upon the walls of Uruk he stood with Urshanabi, whose wife was the goddess Nanshi, sacred to foundations and ground plans of buildings. And Gilgamesh asked him if the wall that he had built was not great. Did it not meet all the criteria of greatness? He had built those walls himself, and it was a consolation that he told himself was all he could have because he was not able to find immortal life. And Urshanabi said that yes, it was a fine wall, a good wall, and that Gilgamesh had done well. He would be forever famous as the builder of the walls of the city of Uruk. And Urshanabi bid him good night in the twilight as the enameled oyster of the crescent moon slid into view, the god Nanisine and Venus, the goddess Inanna, who was out upon the western horizon as the evening star, and those two luminaries cast their soft gold light upon him, just as they had done for his father Lugabanda when he was sick in the cave. Now this is where the traditional story ends, but there is a Sumerian story that serves nicely as an epilogue, and which I think actually is the whole point of the story, and which the original writer of the Old Babylonian version leaves out because he knows that everybody knows that Gilgamesh was the first man to become the Lord of the Dead in the underworld. So his quest is not a failure. It is typically read as a tale of the failure of man to ever attain immortality. All men must die, except that that's not the point of the epic. The point of the epic is Gilgamesh's initiation through the 12 signs of the zodiac and his knowledge, his complete knowledge of the cosmos that renders him eligible to become the judge of the dead in the underworld, to take on the same role that Osiris takes on in Egypt. Everyone knew that Gilgamesh was Lord of the Dead. There was no need to append this Sumerian story that was not written by whoever wrote the Old Babylonian epic. It's a Sumerian tale, but it makes a nice epilogue. 12. Epilogue. And years later, as he lay sick and he grew limp and weak and wasted, he was old and he was thinking of Enkidu, but he was tired and sweat leaked from his limbs with a fever, and he fell into a deep sleep and had a dream. And in the dream the gods were gathered together in council, An and Enlil and Enki, and they all gathered together in council, and Gilgamesh stood before them. And they said, "Your condition, the fact that you have traveled the road of Shamash, and that you cut down the cedar tree and slew Humbaba, and you brought down the rites from the dark and distant lands, and brought them back to Sumer to restore them to proper order from whence they had been forgotten. For these reasons, Gilgamesh, you shall be made governor of the netherworld. As a ghost form, you shall be made to give forth all the verdicts and judgments of those who come before you. For now your day of mortality has come, and you must put your life in order, for from henceforth you shall become a god, and lord of the dead in the underworld. What you say will weigh as much as the word of Ningish, Sita, and Dumutzi. You are mortal, yes, and soon you will die, Gilgamesh. But do not despair, as you will be accounted one of the Anuna, and you will become one of the lesser gods in the netherworld, where your judgments will carry the weight of Ereshkigal and Nergal." When Gilgamesh awoke from the dream, he knew it to be true, and knew that the gods had planned for him to become a god, the lord of the dead in the underworld after all. And he began to make preparations for his tomb, with its stone walls of diorite, and its many and varied treasures taken from the trees at the Mashu Mountains, where the sun rises. All right, that's it.